Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our sixth plenary talk by Dr. Gustavo Ventura. He's a professor in the economics department of the W.P. Carey School of Business at Arizona State University. His research interests are on inequality, taxation, and economic development from a macroeconomic perspective. His work has been published in leading peer-reviewed journals such as the Journal of Monetary Economics, the Review of Economic Studies, the Review of Economic Dynamics, and the International Economic Review. Today, Dr. Ventura's talk will focus on the story of economic success in Argentina in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Dr. Ventura, please go ahead.
Well, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. The title of the talk is a bit pretentious. I'm going to call this Making a Miracle, Argentina, 1870-1929. So, in several ways, I mean, in different ways we can think about this. Argentina was the economic miracle of the late 19th century and the early 20th century. I'm not going to go into history, but I'm going to say the following. It was an isolated region, fragmented among different provinces that went in constant sort of war against each other, sometimes in open war. And the region went from this isolated and fragmented region into a spectacular case of early development. And in my humble opinion, it hasn't received enough attention in the literature, although there are many papers and books written about this. What I'm going to do today is to quantify and describe at the big picture level this experience. And then I will try to elaborate on what is, in my opinion at least, what really happened in Argentina from an economic policy perspective. Full disclosure, I am not an economic historian. I am a macroeconomist. I'm obsessed with models and numbers. So I'm going to focus on the big picture. Why 1870? Well, this is simply because this is the end of conflict following the full integration of the country in 1860, and I'm going to stop in 1929 because this was a massive shock for the country. The start of the Great Depression, the collapse of world trade, that led to a supercharged depression in the country, political turmoil, and so on. I'm going to use simple data and sources to document all this. I'm going to document patterns of output, population, trade, and migration, and I'm going to focus again 1870, 1929. The main source of data for population and GDP is going to come from the Madison Project database. And since I'm going to be comparing Argentina with the US and other countries, I'm going to use some data from a famous historical atlas, the International Historical Statistic from Mitchell. And I'm also going to use some data from a recent paper on trade that tried to homogenize trade data across different countries. So some preliminaries. Argentina was not a very poor location, but it was relatively poor. It was about 40% of the UK in 1870, and it went to become about 80% or more of the UK in 1929. I mean, relative to the US, which in the middle of the sample period became the frontier, became the leader in output. Argentina was about 50% in 1870 and approximately 60% in 1929. There's an explosion of population in the period. Okay? Population multiplied by more than 6 times in the period, and the main reason for this was immigration. This immigration came together with massive flows of capital into the country that became key in infrastructure development. Okay, and the prime example of this is the development of railways. And the other part of the process was that foreign trade led the development process. Our exports multiplied by a factor of about 12 during these periods, and imports grew by an even bigger factor. To say at this point that pretty much not much of what happened in Argentina was reproduced in countries nearby. Uruguay, for example, was a relatively rich country at the start of the sample, but its growth was not spectacular and fell short, or much short than Argentina by the end of the sample. Nothing happened in Brazil, nothing happened in Chile, and so on. So here's a picture of, I'm going to show you pictures of GDP per capita in two ways. First, I'm going to show you GDP per capita 1870, 1913. This is US dollars of 2011. I'm straight ahead showing the data from Madison. Okay, and you can see here the explosion in GDP per capita, and you will see why this was explosion, taking into account the massive increase in population. I show this up to 1913 because there's a hole in the data, which is nothing but World War I, which was one of these big shocks that happened to the economy due to the interruption of foreign trade, foreign investment, foreign flows of immigrants, and so on. So this is the whole sample. Okay, this is Argentina from 1870 to 1929. Okay. By 1929, GDP per person was about $9,300 in dollars of today. And to put this in perspective, is important to do some basic calculations. I mean, the U.S., which by then was a frontier, kept on growing at about 1.9% a year, all the way up to today. If Argentina, which was catching up with the United States, had continued growing at the rate of the United States without catching up, GDP per person would be today about $47,000 in dollars of today. GDP per person in dollars of today, not in PPP, is much less than that, is about 15,000 or so. Okay, so that gives you the sense of where we were and where we are right now. Let me put this in terms of growth rates, and then I'm going to compare these growth rates with other countries. Here I divided the sample in 4 parts. 1870, 1929 is the whole sample. 1870, 1913 is the sample all the way up to World War I, and then is a period that I want to highlight, which is what happens in the early part of the 20th century, when everything gets turbocharged, so to speak, in terms of migration flows and output growth, and the period after World War I. So for the whole sample, Argentina had a GDP per capita growth of about 1.9%. And prior to World War I was about 2.2%, and it's essentially the same during the period, the short time span leading to World War I, precisely when population was growing at a very fast rate. Here, population growth at an annual level was growing at about 3.8%. So I'm going to pause here to think about what this means. 3.8% in terms of population is a monstrosity when GDP per capita is still growing and growing fast. Okay, Just to give you an idea, population growth in the US right now is less than 1%. It's about 0.8% or so. Okay, so this is a process of transformation that is pretty much unheard of at the time. And as I'm going to argue in a minute, this process of transformation is accompanied by a massive wave of immigrants, which transformed the country, transformed the demographic of the country, made the country in a way different than its neighbors, and so on. I'm comparing here 3 countries in terms of GDP per person. Okay, the countries are Argentina, US, and Australia. Why US? Well, because during this period it became the frontier. The US by 1890 approximately became richer than the UK, and became or is well understood to be the leader at the time. And then is Australia, which is a country to which Argentinian historians sometimes have looked at for different reasons. One of them is that it's a temperate, massive, desertic region, isolated from the rest of the world, and so on. Okay? Look at the growth rates. Argentina is growing essentially at more than twice during the whole period the rate of GDP per capita growth of Australia. It's growing faster than the United States, and it's growing faster than the United States and Australia prior to World War I. Is growing faster in the period leading to World War I, 1900, 1913. And certainly is growing faster in the period after World War I. Okay, so I want to put this in perspective. Growth rates of GDP in excess of 2%, while at the same time population is growing at these faster rates, is something that wasn't experienced at the time, and certainly historical examples about this, I think, are rare. Here I put GDP in levels normalized to 1 for all countries. As you can see, Argentinian GDP multiplied by a factor per capita, multiplied by a factor of about 3 in the whole period. The USA is the orange line. It's less than 2.5, and then is Australia and the UK. Okay? So this is a different way to conceptualize in magnitudes what happened in this period in terms of output. If you want to see this in a different way, you can see the comparison with the UK, which is interesting in several ways. Is interesting because at the beginning of the sample, the UK was as I said before, was the frontier, and at the same time it became through we can discuss this in a number of ways. It became the main trade partner of Argentina at the start, although this importance relatively diminishes as time went by. Argentina was about 40% of the UK. As I said earlier, more than 80% of the UK by the end of the sample. Okay? If you want to compare with Australia, Argentina was about 45% of Australia in 1870, and more than 80% of Australia by 1929. Okay? So you can see here this systematic process of catch up from being, let's say, middle income to being a rich economy by 1929. Let me describe now the what happened in terms of population. So population, as I said before, explodes. It goes from about 1.7 million to 11.6, 11.7 million by the end of the sample. The annual growth rates, as I said earlier, is in excess of 3%. Okay, and keep this in mind. This is about twice the growth rate of population in the United States in the same period. If you look at the period before World War I, is almost 4%. This is an invasion, literally, and this is an invasion because much of this was fueled by immigration. Okay, the migration rates in the period far exceeded those from the United States. So the average migration rate into the country was about 2.3% in the whole sample. And it became about 1.2, 1.3% after World War I, when things start unraveling for the movements of people across countries. Here's a picture for population. Kind of a catchy slogan at the time, at the beginning of the sample, due to a former Argentinian president, Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, a president that whose presidency coincided with the start of the period. The punchline was "Gobernar es poblar." To govern is to populate. Well, here's a picture. The population grows by more than a factor of 7. Okay? Australia, which comes next, is less than 4 times relative to the initial population. Next is the US, and next is the UK. Okay? I keep on comparing these countries to get a sense of the magnitudes. Perhaps what is really shocking at this is to go back into the historical records and look at migration rates. Okay, and I'm plotting here two series. The orange series is the migration rates for the United States. Okay, which hover around about 1% or less. And the ones in blue are the ones for Argentina. So migration rates systematically exceed those from the United States. And as I said earlier, if you look at the period 1900, 1913, which coincides with the explosion of movements of people across locations in the world at the time, well, the rates far exceed 2% and are about 3% and more. Okay, so for the first approximation, migration rates into Argentina at the late part of the sample were roughly 3 times those into the United States. Okay, this has dramatic consequences and can change a country big time. And it did. So these migration flows mattered a lot because immigrants were disproportionately of working age. Where the sex ratio was imbalanced, were mostly males at the beginning, and this is very important. And this is something that we are learning more and more as time goes by. They were relatively more skilled than natives. Historical records basically tell us that people of young working age, people from age 13 to age 40, mostly males, were about 72% of the total migrants. So this led to Argentina to have not only high population growth, but also a relatively high growth in the fraction of the population that was available to work, loosely speaking, the labor force. Okay. And what is important here is that, as I said earlier, immigrants were more skilled than natives. Think of this as at the start of the sample is a backward location in which not many people knew how to read and write. Then immigrants start flowing in, attracted by all sorts of opportunities, and in the process of high growth, these people were supplying lots of skills that were in high demand. Okay, and not only that, they provided management and expertise to run different enterprises, which this actually increased the rates of return to capital. In modern language, we can say that immigrants were positively selected in the sense that they were far more skilled than natives. This positive selection was declining at the time. Was declining over time as the domestic population was getting more educated, and the selection of immigrants started to change as we approach World War I and after. This is quite important. This process, I mean, is important in terms of magnitudes, and it's important in terms of these issues of selection. Okay, this is something that the recent historians are more and more documenting, that the selection that actually happened in terms of immigration. Now let me talk a little bit about trade. This development process was trade oriented and was fueled by a boom in export and imports. So if you think about overall trade, export plus imports exploded by a factor of more than 16 in the period. And what is important to keep in mind, and perhaps it's not too surprising after you have seen already, is that this growth in trade far exceeded those in comparable economies. What is not so evident from this is that behind the growth in trade, there was a substantial, large process of reallocation in the production of tradable goods. This process went away from traditional exports, which, let's say, for a moment is leather. Leather was a big deal early on in colonial periods and continued for a while. And this moved into the production of grain commodities, beef, and others. Okay, and what is key also is the adoption of new technologies that complemented the development of land and transportation that accompany all this. Okay, so you can view this as explosion of trade, adoption of technologies, transportation, and a change in product mix, which changed completely the countryside. It went from, as I said, from in the Pampas region, doing mostly leather, towards doing all sorts of things that the country wasn't accustomed to. So here's a picture for exports. Okay, and I'm plotting four economies: Argentina, US, the UK, and Australia. Okay, this is the growth in exports is in excess of a factor of 12. Okay, it follows next by the United States, Australia, and the UK. Okay, we are not going to have time today, but behind this, I'm going to repeat, there was a massive change in the product mix of what was being exported. There are technology developments at the time that were fully adopted in the country. The agricultural frontier was constantly expanding, and all this together with massive infusions of capital allowed for this process. So the other part I'd like to briefly document is the concomitant expansion of infrastructure. Okay, to engage in this process, you need to expand infrastructure, because essentially the country is a desert, as it was called at the time. So railways, ports, telegraphs, and later electricity had to accompany all this process. So the poster example is the development of railways. Okay? So this was open for foreign investment, sometimes with secure guarantees from the government, sometimes without. Okay, and mostly this was behind this were British companies and British consortia that took over different roads, and then other companies from other countries, France in particular, actually started showing up. Okay, so the idea here is not too different from the United States. The idea here is to connect the country, in particular to open up the pampas, these vast fertile lands west of the capital, Buenos Aires, and go south to the border of Patagonia. Connect these to ports, and also connect the parts of the littoral region, the region near the big rivers that was quite fertile, and was the northern part of the pampas as well. Okay, and you also had to move people and goods across the country. So what is key here is that by the year 1870, we know now that the network was essentially non-existent. The U.S., for example, was far ahead of Argentina. But by the end of the sample, the network was more than 9% of the United States, and railways kilometers per person were quite similar. So here's a map of this. I've been looking for maps these days, and I found one. Okay. On the top left panel, you can see what was in 1870. This was essentially nothing in terms of railways. Think that at the time in the United States, many of the big cities, especially in the East Coast, were already connected by railways. Okay, and you can see the progression: 1890, 1910, and then is a map of 1957. By 1957, the map of 1957 is not too different from the map of 1930. By the end of the 30s, actually by 1930, Argentina had a network of about 40,000 kilometers, which is similar to what was in place by 1957, according to this map. What you can see here is the development of railways in the Pampas. How it starts covering the Pampas, and at the southern part and at the northern part of the Pampas. Okay, and it goes all the way to the west side, to Mendoza, San Luis, San Juan, and so on, and also to the north. Okay. If you want to see this in perspective, how this looks relative to the United States, here's the quantification of this. Okay, this is in absolute terms, in kilometers, from essentially 0 to more than 40,000 kilometers by 1930, and as a fraction of the United States. As I said before, by 1930, the network is more than 9% of the United States, and the number of kilometers per passenger are roughly the same. So there is a sort of a logistic representation of this, and you can see the massive explosive growth that happens here. You can imagine that this desert, how this can transform a desert, similar to what happened to the United States. Going from Mendoza to Buenos Aires at the time was measured in days. Okay, you had to cross a desert, and assuming that by the time the country was peaceful, there were not attacks by natives and so on. we're talking about several days. Okay, technical progress in terms of transportation was very slow prior to railways. I mean, some new modes of transportation were slowly being adopted, but this essentially all of them were by horse. Okay, and suddenly you can go from Buenos Aires to Mendoza, say, right next where I come from, right next to the border with Chile, and later to Chile in less than 1 day. This is shocking, and this allows to move people, goods faster, much faster across the country. And what is important here, it allowed the country to move immigrants back and forth. Okay, now enough of quantification. Let me ask the question. The premise of this introductory talk is what really happened in Argentina. The upshot is that Argentina adopted the market economy early on, with very strong protection of property rights, with free movements of people, goods, and capital across borders. That's what happened in one line, and this regime persisted and was very stable all the way through. Okay, so think of a situation where suddenly a region that has vast open territories that are quite fertile, the climate is temperate, and suddenly this explodes. This allows the economy to maximize its potential, its comparative advantage, in lieu of many things. The expansion of demand for food and commodities, the technical advances that were occurring at the time in agriculture, shipping, and communications. In one line, as somebody once told me, this is globalization on steroids, and this is what happened at the time. Okay. Now, what I want to center attention now is into how this happened from an intellectual standpoint. Okay, the idea of creating a country that is a market-based economy open to the rest of the world is an intellectual project. Okay, that goes back in time to the first revolution against the Spaniards, the 1810 revolution, subsequent independence, and the multiple attempts that took place to organize the country. From 1810, which is the first revolution and the first domestic government, to full organization, it took a lot of time. There were civil wars, instability, and so on. All the way, in many ways, this project was delayed all the way up to 1852, in which the regime led by Rosas, the coordinator of provinces centered in Buenos Aires, collapses, which was a heavily protectionist, closed kind of regime. In 1853, the Confederación Argentina is created. It's Confederación Argentina. It's not the Argentine Republic, because Buenos Aires was not in place. It starts with a constitution that has these very strong protections of individual rights, and the consensus is to organize the state, looking at the model of the United States, to heal the wounds from the civil wars, into a federal state in which provinces were autonomous, but individual and civil rights and property rights were enforced across the whole country, and all internal barriers to trade were removed. Okay? In 1860, Buenos Aires joins the Confederation, and the modern country begins. Okay? So where these, well, as I said, this is an intellectual project. I want to think a little bit behind some of the ideas, the ideas behind this, and perhaps the key intellectual person behind this was one of the refugees from the liberal regime that preceded the organization of the countries, the Rosas regime, and this was Alberdi, Juan Bautista Alberdi. He was the intellectual force behind the Constitution. In a way, he saw the future, and he wrote several books. He wrote two that are key here. The first one is essentially a manual for the politicians at the time trying to organize the country after years of fights and provincial discords. And then he wrote a book which is actually very interesting to read, because it shows some fine knowledge of economics, some understanding of the benefits of trade, and a kind of and because he was not a person from Buenos Aires, he understood very well how the rest of the country looked like. The name of the book is Sistema Económico y Rentístico de la Confederación Argentina. This is actually a very interesting book, because it prescribes what is the economic policy of the new country, given the organization, the political organization that is established in the Constitution. So what is the Constitution of 1853-1860? I call it 5360, as many people do, because the Constitution is enacted in 1853. And then there is an episode of conflict with Buenos Aires, and Buenos Aires, the big province, effectively accepts joining the rest. And it's not a peaceful union at the beginning, but then effectively happens. The country consolidates, and the Constitution is amended to allow for Buenos Aires as part of the country, and Buenos Aires, the city of Buenos Aires, being the capital of the new country. So this is the Constitution of 1853-1860. So, in the view of many, and I'm included, the Constitution is the key for the subsequent success that came. The Constitution assigned full civil rights and property rights to everyone who inhabit the territory, except for political rights for foreigners as well. So all rights were except for political rights were given to those who inhabit the territory, regardless of citizenship. Citizenship only mattered to vote, pretty much. And there are two things that I'm going to show you in a minute. It essentially ensured the free navigation of rivers. That was a very frictional and contentious issue, and mandated that the federal government had to allow and promote European immigration. Okay, this is in the Constitution. Why free navigations of rivers? Because by the time Alberdi was thinking, the main vehicle to move goods and people into the country were the massive rivers that end up in the River Plate, end up in Buenos Aires, and there was a source of conflict. Buenos Aires wanted to control access to the rivers and collect taxes and so on, and the agreement was that anybody had the right to freely navigate these rivers, trade, and so on. So there are several articles that are key to highlight, and they were enforced, by the way, highlight what happened. I took an available translation of the Constitution in a law book, okay, and I'm highlighting some parts of different articles, and underline some things that are key. Article 14 is in many ways is the Bill of Rights of the Argentinian Constitution. Article 14 establishes that everyone has a set of rights, okay? Working and practicing industry, navigating and trading, entering, remaining, and traveling in the country without any barriers, free expression, and so on. What is key is that these rights were extended not just to citizens, but were extended to all inhabitants of the nation, as the article says. Okay. It also establishes for all inhabitants the free practice of religion, which was a contention sort of issue before. Okay. So from the get-go, the country is open to immigrants, and immigrants have access to all these rights, and they can practice their religion. It explains, for example, why early on many immigrants from Northern Europe, who were not Catholic, actually came to the country, and why the country absorbed many immigrants, a disproportionate amount of immigrants of a Jewish origin. And here is something very special. I'm not a lawyer, but I'm not sure if many constitutions in the world actually establish this in written form. In Article 20, the Constitution actually states that foreigners enjoy, or repeats that foreigners enjoy in the territory of the country all civil rights. Okay. And it says that they can get citizenship by staying in two countries, but authorities can make them citizens. As by allowing and make them citizen by enactment of laws. But what is key is that they are not two things. They are not obligated to assume citizenship or to pay taxes that are predetermined for foreigners. This is key. This essentially reaffirms the civil rights and economic rights that are given to all those who inhabit the country. Okay. The Article 25 and Article 26 are about navigation and European immigration. Okay. Article 26 essentially mandates the federal government to foster and encourage European immigration and cannot restrict or limit it. Okay. Cannot restrict or limit those foreigners whose purpose is, as quote, tilling the soil, improving industries, introducing and teaching the sciences and the arts. Article 26 is about the free navigation of rivers, and this is established in the Constitution to be free for all flags. Okay. In many ways, since the Constitution was effective through all the period, was enforced. It fostered development and immigration of millions of people. And what is important is that this constitutional order was uninterrupted until 1930, and was still able to accommodate multiple changes such as the mandate for public education, the expansion of the franchise to all citizens and so on. Okay. So I'm going to conclude here. I'm going to answer questions you may have, if you have. In quantitative terms, the development of Argentina was a phenomenon of first order importance. It was a miracle, no matter how you look at it, in terms of output, attraction of labor, and attraction of capital. So a notion of complementarity is key here. Argentina was stable and open at the right time. In a way, it was lucky because is lucky by design, because it was stable and open at the right time. And because of that, capital and labor flowed in. Huge amounts of land became productive as a result, and the comparative advantages became fully exploited. I mean, it's a topic for a different discussion, but the contrast between this period and what came after is hard not to notice. Okay, there's a lot to think here. Perhaps the stagnation and relative decline that came after is connected to the massive success that occurred during this period, but that's at the moment just a speculation. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Ventura. We have a couple of questions. The first one is particular to the migration. So did they arrive to cities only? Do they immigrants distributed evenly across the country, and what jobs did they actually go into?
That's very good. The immigrants primarily distributed. I mean, I don't have the data with me about the spatial distribution of immigrants over time. But clearly, immigrants were going into where they were mostly needed. They were going far west, where I come from, the so-called Cuyo region, and they were concentrating in the big cities that were developing at the time: Buenos Aires, Rosario, Córdoba. They were scattered in the Pampas region, in the littoral region. If you look at some books, some of the description of the Pampas at the time is called the Pampa Gringa, which is the Pampa of the immigrants, those who came to work in different occupations in agriculture or connected to agricultural machinery and so on, and stayed and became the staple of the small towns, mid-sized towns that developed at the time. So yes, they were concentrated in some regions. You asked me also about occupations or so?
Yes, occupations.
Excuse me. Early on, think of this as early on. I mean, this selection of immigrants were more pronounced early on because the source of immigrants were coming from regions in Europe that were already experiencing had already experienced the Industrial Revolution and so on. And when this development starts to happen, many call them professions at the moment had to be filled, and therefore there were those who build cartridges, were watchmakers, those in charge of printing presses, and so on, were the first one to come. Those who were operating ports came. Those who were operating railways came with the foreign investment. The notion of there's kind of a maybe romantic notion of the British engineer that comes to the country, goes to the interior, marries a local, and creates a family and so on. This is, I mean, this is quite common. So I mean, big picture. Early on, these immigrants were essentially the skilled labor, so to speak, gradually they were percolating into simpler and simpler or more manual types of labor as time went by. The composition of immigrants changed. So towards the end of the 19th century is the beginning of the massive entry of people like me, that came from whose ancestors came from Spain and Italy. Okay, and this is when the selection starts changing. First are the northern Italians, then gradually are the Spaniards and those coming from southern Italy. Okay.
Great. We have a couple of questions related to basically what happened after. So what will be the hypothesis of why Argentina got stagnated? Was it a change in the constitution?
No.
Or was something else?
I mean, this is a speculation. What happens is if you look at my slides still in, can I show my slides still?
Yes.
Look at this picture, for example. Look at exports from essentially the behavior of exports essentially with World War I. It's a collapse on exports. Okay, the shock of the depression was a possibly an even bigger shock. Okay, and that created too much of turmoil. I mean, Argentina was a textbook open economy in terms of movements of goods, capital, and labor. And the shock of the depression, the collapse of world trade that didn't recover, was a big shock. At the time, also there was I haven't talked about this, but one of the main events in the period. Let me see if I have it here. Yeah, one of the main events in the period is the Sáenz-Peña law. Sáenz-Peña law is the massive expansion of the franchise. Think of this as all the masses that had come to the country. Many of them were citizens. Their kids were citizens, and now everybody voted. Okay, and the first president by popular election is Hipólito Yrigoyen. Okay, and then Marcelo de Alvear. Okay, in 1928, Yrigoyen comes back. Okay, and he's sort of a weak leader. The Great Depression hits, and there's a bit also of political turmoil, and there's an interruption of the constitutional order. Okay. So this collapse of the institutional order is concomitant with the collapse of world trade, the push for more protectionist measures, and so on, regulation of trade, and it's a long gradual list to World War II, Perón, and what comes after. Argentina is still by the start of Perón presidency, by 1950, about 60% of the United States. Okay, so you can say that in terms of catch-up, the catch-up stopped. It wasn't. I mean, it didn't continue. Then is a process of relative decline with import substitution policies, all sorts of distortions imposed on the economy, and so on.
A related question, but going back in time, is about what happened earlier. What was the conflict between Buenos Aires and the provinces, and how basically the constitution arrived in the very first place?
Oof. The conflict, once we got rid of the evil Spaniards, you had to organize the country, and getting rid of the Spaniards is relatively easy. in relation to what comes after. My interpretation of the period is that there were essentially one big region, Buenos Aires, wanted to, or the city of Buenos Aires wanted to have free trade and collect custom duties and be rich in such a way. The rest of the country, including the province of Buenos Aires, did not like this because imports were going to compete against their products and so on. And then are the this is the process of civil wars that starts essentially pretty much after the independence wars. Starts essentially in 1820. There is a consolidation of some notion of a federal government under the Rosas regime, who happens to be quite protectionist, and who happens to be in the parlance of the time a federal. Is the federal party, the party that wanted very heavy autonomy of the provinces against the Unitario party, which was the party essentially of Buenos Aires and some cities in the interior, who wanted a modern organization and openness to the rest of the world and so on. My interpretation is that by the 1840s, the cost of not being integrated with the rest of the world starts showing up. This despotic regime of Rosas starts cracking because of some provinces that were allies start seeing that they are losing from the opportunity to trade. Okay, and those who depose Rosas are essentially federales, who are against, essentially want to trade, want a different organization of the country, preserving the autonomy of the provinces, and this is what led to a big confrontation in 1852 between federales, obviously unitarios joining them against Rosas, and by then this sort of intellectuals essentially co-opted the rebels and basically convinced them to organize the country in the way it was organized. So this was an organization. It's essentially a persuasion of the elites, in my interpretation. But again, I'm not a historian, and this is just these are my observations from afar.
One final question about the economic system in Argentina at the time. Was this all export-led oriented in terms of the production of meat, or was there some sort of proto-industrialization as well?
What we know now is that from 1900 onwards, the manufacturing sector was exploding. Okay, and in some people argue that the development of the manufacturing sector was I mean, the first signs of a structural transformation actually were already happening, in which the domestic manufacturing sector was performing better than the traditional sector, so to speak, that was in the business of exporting to the rest of the world. Okay. Now you said beef. It's a little bit of a misleading notion, that one. Okay. Early on, it wasn't beef. Okay. Then there's the adoption of the technical developments at the time, which was big. I mean, two big things. One is the reduction in trade costs that happened over time, and one thing that was key for the Pampas region was the development of the capacity to transport refrigerated beef. Okay, think of, I mean, the kind of the fairy tale. You grow beef in the Pampas, put it on a ship, and ship it to Manchester and Birmingham, where all the hungry workers are. Okay, this happened due to technical change. Okay, so big changes had to happen inside the country. This is the relocation process I mentioned before for this to happen. You have to shift away from traditional production in the Pampas to the use of different cattle, to the use of to sheep production, to the adoption of high value added species for in terms of cattle, and this actually, the moment it starts happening, it starts losing importance in relative terms. Okay, because then is the push for the production of different types of commodities. Okay, so if you want to think, you want to have a sense of how massive the transformation was. In 1870, Argentina was an importer of wheat flour. Okay, okay, so wheat production was not in the Pampas, was not in the littoral region around the city of Rosario. Actually, the little wheat production was concentrated on the desertic areas where I come from, far west. Okay, so by 1870, Argentina was importing flour. Okay, and then all the development of land happens. The introduction of agriculture machinery, farm workers, and so on, and this transformation happens. By the end of the sample, Argentina was one of the top producers of grain and commodities in the world.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gustavo. Thank you, everybody, for coming. We remind you that next week we will have class by Professor Jesus Fernandez Villaverde about the mid-20th century. Thank you, everybody. Bye.